The wind off the Pacific had teeth that morning. It cut through the Douglas firs like something alive, rattling branches, scraping bark, carrying the smell of salt and snow across the Olympic Peninsula. February in Washington state meant gray skies that never fully lifted and a cold that settled into your bones whether you wanted it there or not. Elijah Corvin woke at 4:37, same as every morning for the past 4 years. No alarm. Yeah, just habit. The kind of habit that gets drilled into you when you spend 2 decades learning to wake before the enemy does. He lay still for a moment listening. The cabin was silent except for the soft rhythm of breathing from the floor beside the bed. Ranger. 7-year-old German Shepherd, black saddle coat, amber eyes that missed nothing. The dog hadn't moved yet, which meant the perimeter was clean. Eli swung his legs out of bed, bare feet hitting cold wood. 42 years old. His knees reminded him of that fact every morning, a dull ache that started in his left knee and worked its way up through his spine like a badly tuned instrument. Shrapnel from Fallujah. A fractured vertebra from a helicopter drop gone wrong in Yemen. The body kept score even when the mind tried to forget. He dressed in the dark. Thermal shirt, fleece jacket, cargo pants, worn soft from years of use. Pulled on boots without lacing them all the way. Moved through the cabin like a ghost, every footfall deliberate, every motion measured. The floor didn't creak under his weight because he knew which boards to avoid. 4 years in this place, and he'd memorized every sound it made. The cabin itself was small, one room serving as bedroom, kitchen, and living space. A wood stove in the corner, its embers still glowing faintly from the fire he'd banked before bed. A table he'd built from reclaimed timber. 2 chairs, though he only ever used one. Shelves lined with books he'd read, cover to cover twice over, mostly histories and survival manuals. No television, no computer. A battery-powered radio sat on the windowsill, but he hadn't turned it on in 8 months. This was the life he'd chosen. Isolation, silence. The kind of quiet that let a man think or stop thinking entirely depending on what he needed most. Ranger stood and stretched a long pull that started at his shoulders and worked down through his hindquarters. The dog's routine was as fixed as Eli's. Stretch, shake, move to the door, wait. Eli opened it and the cold rushed in like an accusation. Ranger stepped out onto the porch, nose lifting, to test the air. His ears swiveled forward, then back, scanning for movement in the pre-dawn darkness. Eli followed, pulling the door shut behind him. The porch overlooked a bluff that dropped 70 feet to the rocky shore below. The Pacific stretched out beyond, black and restless under a sky that hadn't decided whether to snow or just threaten it. He could hear the waves, a steady crash and retreat that never stopped, never changed. It was the closest thing to peace he'd found since leaving the teams. He'd come here in May 2021, 3 months after they'd buried Sarah. 3 months after the funeral where he had stood in his dress blues and listened to people tell him she was in a better place, that time would heal, that he needed to stay strong. All the things people say when they don't know what else to offer. He'd nodded and thanked them and felt nothing except the weight of the folded flag they'd given him, even though Sarah hadn't been military. The flag had been his from his own service, and somehow that made it worse. The car accident had been quick, they told him. She wouldn't have suffered. He'd been at the base in Virginia when it happened, processing out after 20 years of active duty. She'd been driving to pick him up. Black ice on Route 17, just outside Fredericksburg. The truck that hit her had been doing 60 in a 45 zone. The driver walked away with a broken collarbone. Sarah died before the ambulance arrived. Eli had received the call while sitting in a windowless office signing discharge papers. The casualty assistance officer had driven him to the hospital, but there was nothing to see except a closed door and a chaplain who kept saying he was sorry. After that, everything became a blur of arrangements in paperwork and phone calls to family members he barely knew anymore. He'd gone through it all on autopilot the same way he'd gone through missions. One step, then the next, until the objective was complete. The funeral had been the end of it. He'd stood at the graveside and realized he had nowhere to go. No deployment waiting, no team to rejoin, just an empty house in Virginia that still smelled like her perfume, and a future that stretched out blank and terrible. So he'd sold the house, packed his truck, and driven west with Ranger in the passenger seat. Drove until the roads ran out and the trees closed in and the ocean appeared like a wall at the edge of the continent. Found this cabin through a veterans network, a place owned by a widow who didn't ask questions. Paid cash for a year's rent, then another year, then a third, then a fourth. Kept to himself, learned the rhythms of the forest, the moods of the sea, the weight of silence. People left him alone. The locals knew he was former military, saw the bearing, the scars, the way he moved through town on his monthly supply runs without making eye contact or small talk. They nodded and let him be, which was exactly what he wanted. Ranger was the only company he needed. The dog had been his partner on 4 deployments, had saved his life twice, and never once asked him to explain why he'd chosen this exile over anything resembling a normal life. Ranger finished his perimeter check and returned to the porch, sitting at Eli's feet with his ears still alert. The dog's breath made small clouds in the cold air. Eli reached down and scratched behind his ears, feeling the familiar texture of scar tissue along the left side of Ranger's skull. Shrapnel, same firefight that had taken out Eli's knee. They'd both limped for a month after that one. The sky was starting to lighten, a faint gray seeping into the black. Eli could make out the shapes of trees now, the jagged line of the bluff, the white caps on the distant swells. It would be a cold day, the kind where the moisture in the air turned your lungs raw and your joints stiff. Good. He preferred the cold. It kept people indoors, kept the trails empty, kept the world at a distance. He was about to turn back inside when Ranger's posture changed. The dog's entire body went rigid, hackles rising along his spine like a fuse being lit from tail to neck. His ears pinned flat against his skull, and a sound emerged from deep in his chest. Not a bark, not a growl. Something lower, more primal. The sound a wolf makes when it catches the scent of something wrong. Eli's hand went instinctively to his hip, where a sidearm would have been if he'd been wearing one. He wasn't. The Glock was inside in a lockbox under the bed. 4 years of peace had made him careless, or maybe just hopeful that he could leave that part of himself behind. He crouched beside Ranger, hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling the tension vibrating through muscle and bone. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Ranger's nose pointed northeast toward the tree line that marked the edge of the property. His tail was low-body coiled, every sense locked onto something Eli couldn't see yet. The dog's nostrils flared, reading information from the wind that human senses couldn't process. Eli had learned to trust that nose more than his own eyes. Ranger could smell fear, aggression, gunpowder blood, could differentiate between a deer moving through underbrush and a human trying to move quietly. Right now the message was clear. Something was out there, and it wasn't supposed to be. Eli stayed low, scanning the forest. The light was still weak, everything rendered in shades of gray. He could see the faint outline of the trail that led down from the main road, a quarter-mile of switchbacks through dense pine and fir. No movement, no sound except the wind and the waves and Ranger's warning rumble. Then he heard it. Faint, almost swallowed by the wind, the crack of a branch under weight. Not the sharp snap of deadfall breaking naturally, but the muffled crunch of something being stepped on. Someone trying to move quietly, but not quite managing it. Eli's pulse didn't spike. That was one thing the Navy had trained out of him early. Adrenaline was useful, but panic would kill you faster than any bullet. He breathed slow and even, watching, waiting. Ranger's growl deepened, and Eli pressed a hand to the dog's flank. "Easy," he murmured. "Not yet." 2 figures emerged from the tree line. No 3. The first was a woman stumbling, more than running, arms wrapped around something. A child. The second and third were men spread wide, moving with the deliberate spacing of people who'd done this before. One carried what looked like a rifle, the other a handgun, both held low but ready. They were maybe 200 yards out, closing the distance toward the cabin with purpose. Eli's mind shifted gears, cataloging details. The woman was injured, favoring her left side. The child wasn't moving, either unconscious or too scared. The men weren't dressed for hiking. Dark jackets, tactical pants, boots that were too clean for this terrain. They moved like operators, which meant training, which meant this wasn't random. The woman saw the cabin and changed direction, angling toward it with the desperate energy of someone who had nothing left to lose. One of the men shouted something, the words lost in the wind, but the tone was clear. "Stop or we shoot!" Eli watched her keep running. The man with the rifle raised it, sighting down the scope. Eli could see it all playing out in the next 5 seconds. The shot, the woman dropping, the child hitting the ground, the men closing in to finish whatever this was. It wasn't his fight. He didn't know these people. He'd spent 4 years building a life where other people's problems stayed other people's problems. He looked at Ranger. The dog was staring at him. Amber eyes locked on his face, waiting for the command that would tell him what they were going to do. And in that moment, Eli saw Sarah. Not a memory exactly, but the weight of her absence. The way she used to look at him when he came home from a deployment, the silent question in her eyes. Did you do the right thing out there? Did you come back as the man I married or something else? He'd never been able to answer that question. Not honestly. The woman was 100 yards out now, close enough that Eli could hear her labored breathing, the wet rasp of someone running on a fever or an injury or both. The child in her arms was small, maybe 5 or 6, wrapped in a blanket that was soaked through. The men were 50 yards behind, closing fast. Eli stood. "Inside," he said to Ranger, and the dog bolted through the door without hesitation. Eli followed, moving fast, but controlled muscle memory taking over. He crossed to the bed, dropped to his knees, and pulled the lockbox from underneath. Combination lock, 4 digits, Sarah's birthday. The box opened and he grabbed the Glock 19, checked the chamber, confirmed the magazine was full. 15 rounds. He had 2 spare mags in the box, grabbed those 2, stuffed them in his jacket pockets. Ranger was at the door, body tense, waiting. Eli moved to the window, staying low, and looked out. The woman had reached the clearing in front of the cabin 20 yards out. She stumbled, went down hard on her knees, but kept hold of the child. One of the men was raising his rifle again. Eli opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, weapon at low ready. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice carrying across the distance with the flat authority of someone used to being obeyed. The 2 men stopped. The woman looked up, her face pale and streaked with something dark. Blood or mud, Eli couldn't tell from here. The man with the rifle swung it toward Eli, and that was a mistake. You don't point a weapon at someone unless you're ready to use it, and the hesitation in his movement said he wasn't sure yet. Eli didn't hesitate. He raised the Glock sight picture, perfect finger on the frame, not the trigger. "Drop it," he said. The man with the rifle looked at his partner, then back at Eli. He was young, maybe late 20s, with the kind of face that hadn't seen enough hard things yet to know when to quit. "This doesn't concern you, old man," he said. "Walk away." Eli didn't move, didn't blink, just held the sight picture, his breathing slow and even. He could feel Ranger behind him, a coiled spring, ready to launch. "You're on my property," Eli said. "That makes it my concern. Drop the weapon. Last time I'm asking." The young man's finger moved toward the trigger. Eli saw it, processed it, and made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He shifted his aim 2 inches right and fired. The shot cracked across the clearing, sharp and final. The bullet hit the rifle's receiver, shattering the scope and sending the weapon spinning out of the man's hands. The man yelped and stumbled back, clutching his fingers. The second man raised his handgun, and Eli was already moving, sidestepping left, while bringing the Glock back on target. He fired again, this time, hitting the ground 6 inches in front of the man's feet, kicking up dirt and frozen grass. The message was clear. Next one goes higher. Both men turned and ran, crashing back into the trees with none of the tactical discipline they'd shown coming in. Eli watched them go, weapons still raised, counting to 30 in his head. When they didn't reappear, he lowered the Glock and turned to the woman. She was still on her knees, holding the child, her eyes wide with something between terror and disbelief. Eli crossed the distance in 4 strides, Ranger at his heel. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd thought, late 20s maybe, with dark hair plastered to her skull by sweat and rain. Her jacket was torn at the shoulder, and blood seeped through the fabric. The child in her arms was a little girl, maybe 6 years old, pale and unconscious, her breathing shallow and fast. "Can you walk?" Eli asked. The woman nodded, but when she tried to stand, her legs gave out. Eli caught her with his free hand, steadying her. "Ranger clear," he said, and the dog took off toward the tree line, circling wide to make sure the men were really gone. Eli holstered the Glock and crouched down. "I'm going to carry her," he said, nodding toward the child. "You follow me. We need to get inside before they come back with friends." The woman didn't argue. She let him take the child, and he felt the weight of her, small and fragile, burning with fever even through the wet blanket. He stood the girl cradled against his chest and started toward the cabin. The woman followed, limping badly, one hand pressed to her side. Ranger returned, giving a single low bark. All clear. They made it inside, and Eli kicked the door shut behind them, laying the child on the bed. The woman collapsed into the chair by the table, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Eli moved fast, pulling blankets from the closet, stripping the wet clothes off the child, wrapping her in dry wool. Her skin was hot to the touch, fever spiking hard. He checked her pupils, her pulse the color of her lips. Not good, but not critical yet. He turned to the woman. "What's her name?" "Emma," the woman said, her voice hoarse. "Her name is Emma." "What's wrong with her?" "Fever started 2 days ago. I don't have medicine. I don't have anything." Eli crossed to the cabinet above the sink, pulled out a first aid kit that was better stocked than most small-town clinics. Ibuprofen, antibiotics, sterile dressings. He grabbed a bottle of water from the shelf and brought it all to the bed. "This is going to help," he said, more to himself than to the woman. He crushed 2 ibuprofen tablets, mixed them with water, and carefully spooned the mixture into Emma's mouth. She swallowed reflexively, a good sign. He turned back to the woman. "You're bleeding. Let me see." She hesitated, then pulled her hand away from her side. The blood was coming from a wound just below her ribs, a gash maybe 3 inches long. Not deep enough to be fatal, but deep enough to need stitches. Eli grabbed gauze and antiseptic, working quickly. The woman flinched but didn't cry out. "Who were those men?" Eli asked as he worked. "I don't know their names," she said, "but I know who sent them." "Who?" She looked at him, and for the first time he really saw her eyes. Gray-blue, sharp with intelligence and pain. "Victor Hale," she said, "defense contractor, billionaire. He wants me dead because I know what he's been doing." Eli finished wrapping the wound and sat back on his heels. What's he been doing? Experiments. On veterans. Turning them into something else. The words hung in the air like smoke. Eli felt something cold settle into his chest. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Claire," she said. "Claire Harlow." The name hit him like a fist. Harlow. He stared at her pieces clicking into place. "Marcus Harlow," he said. "The diplomat. Ramadi 2019. Her eyes widened. "You know my father." "I saved his life," Eli said. "Pulled him out of an ambush. He made me promise if anything happened to him, I'd protect his family." He paused, the weight of that old promise settling onto his shoulders like a pack full of stones. He died in late 2022. Heart attack, they said. Just over 2 years ago. Claire's face hardened. They lied. He was murdered because he found out what Hale was doing and he was going to expose it. Eli stood processing this. 6 years. He'd carried that promise for 6 years without knowing how to fulfill it, and now here she was, bleeding in his cabin with men hunting her and a child burning up with fever. Fate had a cruel sense of timing. Ranger moved to the bed, sniffing Emma gently, then sat beside her like a sentinel. The child's breathing was starting to even out, the fever breaking just slightly from the medicine. Claire watched the dog, something softening in her expression. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for helping us." Eli didn't respond. He moved to the window, checking the tree line. No movement yet, but those men would be back. They'd call for backup, Regroup, come in harder. He had maybe an hour or two if he was lucky. He turned back to Claire. Tell me everything, he said. Start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out. She took a shaky breath and began to talk. Her father, she said, had survived Ramadi come home to a desk job at the Inspector General's office. Started investigating defense contractors in 2020, looking into cost overruns and shady accounting. One name kept appearing. Victor Hale, CEO of Hale Defense Corporation. The company had dozens of contracts with the Department of Defense, most of them classified. Black budget stuff. The kind of money that disappeared into programs with names like Vestige and Phantom and Aegis. Marcus Harlow had started asking questions. Why were so many veterans being recruited for medical studies after discharge? Why were the mortality rates so high? Why did the few who came back seem different, changed hollow? He'd compiled evidence, built a case, and was 3 weeks from presenting it to Congress when he died. Massive coronary, the coroner said. Stress and age and bad genetics. But Claire knew better. Her father had been healthy, active, careful. The night before he died, he'd called her, told her to keep copies of everything, to trust no one. The next morning, he was gone. Claire had gone to work for Hale Defense 6 months later, using a fake resume and a manufactured background. Got hired as a logistics coordinator, low-level, invisible. Spent 8 months working her way through security clearances, gaining access to files her father never could have reached. And what she found made her blood run cold. Project Vestige, a neural reconditioning program designed to eliminate PTSD, enhance combat effectiveness, create soldiers who could function without fear or hesitation. On paper, it sounded almost noble. Help veterans heal, give them purpose, make them whole again. But the reality was darker. The program used experimental brain implants, chemical cocktails, psychological conditioning that bordered on torture, and the mortality rate was 30%. 3 out of every 10 subjects died during treatment. The ones who survived often wished they hadn't. Claire had stolen the data 6 months ago. Every file, every test subject, every death certificate that had been falsified. Copied it all to a micro SD card and ran. Hale's security team had been hunting her ever since, across 4 states, through a dozen safe houses. She'd stayed ahead of them until 3 days ago, when they'd found her in a motel outside Portland. She'd barely escaped with Emma, the daughter of her former partner, a woman named Sarah, who'd been killed helping Claire flee. Wait, Eli's mind snagged on that name. Sarah, he said, his voice sharp. What was her last name? Claire looked confused. Cortez, Sarah Cortez. She was a researcher at Hale Defense. Helped me gather evidence. They killed her for it. Not the same Sarah, then. Eli felt something unclench in his chest. His Sarah had been a teacher, nothing to do with defense contractors or conspiracies. Just bad luck and black ice. He pushed the thought away. Emma is Sarah's daughter, Claire continued. She saw them kill her mother. Hasn't spoken since. I've been trying to get her somewhere safe, but there's nowhere left to run. Why come here? Eli asked. Claire met his eyes. Because before my father died, he gave me a list. Names of people he trusted, soldiers he'd worked with, men who'd served with honor. Your name was on it. Elijah Corvin, Olympic Peninsula, Washington. He said if I ever needed help, you were someone who'd keep a promise. Eli felt the weight of that settling onto him. Marcus Harlow had been dying in his arms 6 years ago, bleeding out from shrapnel, and instead of asking Eli to save him, he'd asked him to save his family. And Eli had said yes the way you always say yes when a man is dying. You give him whatever peace you can, even if it's a lie. Except it wasn't a lie anymore. The debt had come due. He walked to the table, poured water from a pitcher into a glass, and handed it to Claire. She drank like she'd been lost in the desert water spilling down her chin. When she finished, she set the glass down and looked at him with something desperate and grateful and terrified all at once. I have proof, she said. Everything my father found, everything I found, it's all on the SD card. If I can get it to the right people, Hale goes to prison. The program shuts down. The families of the men who died get answers. Where's the card? Eli asked. Claire gestured weakly toward Emma. She's wearing it, around her neck, in a locket. Eli moved to the bed, gently lifting the thin chain from around Emma's neck. The locket was small silver, tarnished with age. He opened it, expecting a photo. Instead, he found a tiny compartment and inside a micro SD card no bigger than a fingernail. He held it up to the light, this small piece of plastic that apparently held enough secrets to bring down a billionaire. Can I see what's on it? He asked. Claire nodded. There's a laptop in my bag, if you can find it. The bag was still outside where she'd dropped it. Eli retrieved it along with Ranger, who'd been standing guard on the porch. Inside the bag held a battered laptop, some clothes, a few granola bars, and a handgun with an empty magazine. Claire had been running on fumes. He opened the laptop, inserted the SD card, and waited for the files to load. What appeared on the screen made his stomach turn. Folders labeled by year, each containing hundreds of files, medical records, test results, video footage. He clicked on one at random. A video played showing a man strapped to a chair, electrodes attached to his head, a doctor in a white coat standing beside him with a clipboard. The man was screaming. Eli closed the video, opened another folder. This one contained a spreadsheet. Names, dates, outcomes. He scrolled down, reading. Most of the outcomes were listed as terminated or discontinued. Euphemisms for dead. A few were marked active or stable. He kept scrolling, and then he saw it. Subject Alpha 7, Elijah Corvin, SEAL Team 3, status active. The room tilted. Eli stared at his own name, black letters on a white screen, impossible and undeniable. He clicked on the entry. A new window opened. Video footage dated 4 years ago, May 2021, 3 months after Sarah's funeral. The video showed a white room, sterile and featureless. A man sitting in a chair, his head-shaped electrodes attached to his scalp. The camera angle was from above, looking down. Eli recognized the man's face immediately. It was his own. He watched himself on the screen, motionless, eyes closed. A voice off camera, calm and professional, said something Eli couldn't quite hear. Then another man stepped into frame. Older military, bearing gray hair cropped close. Colonel Wade Garrison, Eli's former commanding officer. The man who'd trained him, deployed with him, stood at his wedding. The man who'd supposedly died in Syria in 2020. Garrison leaned down, said something directly into Eli's ear. On the screen, Eli's eyes opened. Blank. Empty. Like looking at a stranger, the video cut to black. Eli sat frozen, staring at the blank screen. His hands were shaking. He couldn't remember this. Couldn't remember any of it. May 2021. He'd been in Virginia, processing out, dealing with Sarah's death. 3 months had gone by in a fog. He'd assumed it was grief trauma, the normal breakdown that happens when your life implodes. But what if it wasn't? What if they'd done something to him, taken those missing months, filled them with something else? Are you okay? Claire's voice, distant and concerned. Eli closed the laptop, stood, walked to the window. Ranger followed, pressing against his legs, sensing the disturbance. Outside, the sky was fully light now, gray and heavy with the promise of snow. The trees swayed in the wind. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. That file, Eli said, his voice flat. The one with my name. What does it mean? Claire was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle, careful, like she was talking to someone standing on a ledge. It means you were part of the program. Subject Alpha 7, one of the early test cases. The file says you were implanted with a neural interface in May 2021. The procedure was successful. You were categorized as stable and released back into civilian life with no memory of the treatment. Eli's jaw clenched so hard his teeth hurt. How was that possible? I would know. I would remember. That's the point of the program, Claire said quietly. They erase the memory of the procedure, leave you thinking everything is normal. But the implant is still there dormant waiting. Waiting for what? For activation, for orders, for someone to use the trigger phrase that makes you compliant. Eli turned to face her. And if I don't want to be compliant, then you're a threat, and Hale eliminates threats. The implications settled over him like a shroud. For 4 years, he thought he was free, thought he'd left the war behind, built a life on his own terms. But if this was true, if they'd put something in his head, then he'd never been free at all. He was a weapon on a shelf waiting to be picked up and used. Ranger whined softly, nudging Eli's hand. The dog knew something was wrong. Dogs always knew. Eli scratched behind Ranger's ears, grounding himself in the familiar texture of fur and warmth and loyalty that didn't come with the conditions or control. Who else knows about this? Eli asked. Just me, and now you. The files are encrypted. I'm the only one who has the decryption key. Where is it? In my head, memorized, no copies. If something happens to me, the evidence dies with me. Eli processed that. Then we need to make sure nothing happens to you. Claire smiled, bitter and tired. Easier said than done. Hale has resources you can't imagine. Money connections, private security that makes most militaries look amateur. He's been hunting me for 6 months and he's getting closer. Those men today, they weren't even his best team. The real ones are coming. How long do we have? Hours, maybe less. Eli nodded. He'd been in worse situations. Not many, but a few. The key was to stay calm, think tactically, use the terrain. He looked around the cabin, already planning. Exits, choke points, fields of fire. The cabin was defensible, but not for long, not against a professional team, which meant they couldn't stay here. There's a place, he said, about 60 miles north, old military facility decommissioned, Ash Hollow. I trained there back in 2017. It's off the grid, buried in the mountains. If we can make it there, we might have a chance, better than staying here. Claire looked at Emma, still unconscious on the bed, fever-flushed and fragile. She can't travel like this. She needs rest, medicine, time to stabilize. She won't have time if Hale's men find us here. We move in 30 minutes. Pack light. Only what we need. He crossed to the closet, started pulling gear. A backpack, tactical, vest, ammunition, MRS, medical supplies. 4 years of retirement, and he'd kept everything. Some habits you don't break. Ranger watched tail low, understanding that the routine was breaking, that something bad was coming. Eli checked his watch. 4:52 a.m. The sun wouldn't be fully up for another hour. Good. Darkness was an advantage, especially in terrain he knew, and they didn't. He pulled out a map of the Olympic Peninsula, spread it on the table, and traced a route with his finger. 60 miles through national forest, over 2 mountain passes along logging roads that might or might not still be passable this time of year. It would take all day, maybe longer if the weather turned. Claire stood wincing as the movement pulled at her wound. I can't ask you to do this. You don't owe me anything. Eli looked at her. Your father saved my life in Ramadi, took a bullet meant for me, bled out in my arms asking me to protect his family. I made him a promise. I keep my promises, even if it cost you everything, especially then. He went back to packing, efficient and methodical. Ranger's tactical harness on fitted with pouches for medical supplies and ammunition. A rifle case holding his AR-15 cleaned and maintained even though he hadn't fired it in 2 years. A satellite phone with a battery that might still hold a charge. Everything he'd need to fight, run, or survive. Claire watched him work, and something in her expression shifted. Recognition, maybe, or relief. You were a SEAL, she said. My father told me. Said you were one of the best. I was a lot of things, Eli said. Most of them I'd rather forget. He finished packing, slung the rifle case over his shoulder, and turned to Emma. The child was sleeping now, the fever broken enough that her breathing had steadied. He wrapped her in a thermal blanket, lifted her carefully. She was light, too light. Whatever she'd been through had hollowed her out. "Let's go," he said. They stepped out into the cold morning, Ranger leading the way. The forest was waking up, birds starting to call, the wind carrying the scent of pine and salt. Eli scanned the tree line one last time, looking for movement. Nothing yet. But his instincts were screaming that time was running out. They started north, moving fast but careful, Eli carrying Emma while Claire limped beside him. Ranger ranged ahead, nose to the ground, reading the forest for threats. The trail was narrow and steep, switchbacking through dense undergrowth. Eli had walked it 100 times, knew every root and rock. He set a pace that was just shy of punishing, pushing them hard because slow meant dead. 20 minutes in, Ranger stopped. His ears pricked, forward body tense. Eli froze, holding up a hand. "Listen." And then he heard it. The distant thrum of rotors. Helicopter coming in low and fast from the south. He looked up through a gap in the trees, caught a glimpse of black metal and running lights. Military-grade, civilian-owned. Hale's people. "Run," Eli said. They ran. The helicopter swept over them like a predator, rotors churning the air into violence. Eli crashed through underbrush, arms locked around Emma, feeling every jarring step rattle through his knees and spine. Claire stumbled behind him, her breathing ragged, one hand pressed to her wounded side. Ranger darted ahead, finding the path leading them deeper into the forest, where the canopy was thick enough to hide them from aerial view. The sound of the rotors faded east, looping around for another pass. They had maybe 90 seconds before it came back. Eli spotted an outcropping of rock, a shallow overhang crusted with moss and deadfall. He dove under it, pulling Claire after him. They huddled there in the dark, pressed against cold stone, Emma between them, silent and feverish. Ranger squeezed in Lass's body, a warm barrier between them and the opening. The helicopter returned low enough that Eli could feel the downdraft shaking the trees. It hovered directly overhead, searchlight stabbing through gaps in the branches, sweeping back and forth like a mechanical eye. Eli held his breath, feeling Emma's small heart hammering against his chest. If they'd brought thermal imaging, this was over. But the light kept moving, the helicopter drifting north, and after a long, terrible minute, the sound began to fade. Claire exhaled, a sound caught between relief and despair. "They'll land," she whispered. "Send men on foot." Eli nodded. That's what he would do. Use the helicopter to flush them, then ground teams to finish it. Standard hunter-killer tactics. Which meant they had maybe 20 minutes before this forest was crawling with operators who knew what they were doing. He shifted Emma's weight, checked her pulse. Still elevated but steady. The fever was holding, not spiking. She'd make it a few more hours if he could keep her warm and dry. Big if. "Can you walk?" he asked Claire. She nodded, but when she tried to stand, her legs buckled. Eli caught her, felt the tremor running through her muscles. Blood loss, shock, exhaustion. She'd pushed herself past empty and was running on fumes and willpower. He needed to get fluids in her dress that wound properly, let her rest. But there was no time for what he needed. "We keep moving," he said. "Stay close. Ranger scouts ahead. If he stops, we stop. If he runs, we run. Understood?" Claire nodded again, her face pale but determined. They climbed out of the overhang and started north again, moving through terrain that got rougher with every mile. The trail disappeared into game paths, then into no path at all, just steep slopes and fallen timber and rocks slick with moss. Eli navigated by memory and instinct, heading for the high country where the forest thinned and the old logging roads began. Ash Hollow was 60 miles as the crow flew closer to 80, the way they'd have to travel. On foot, carrying a child with an injured woman, and men hunting them, it might as well have been 1,000. The first hour passed in brutal silence. Just the sound of boots on earth, breath sawing through lungs, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. Eli's mind started to drift, fragmented thoughts bleeding into the rhythm of movement. Sarah's face, the funeral, the empty house, and then something else. Something that didn't fit, a white room, fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic and ozone. He blinked, shook his head, tried to focus on the terrain, but the image persisted, sharpening. He was lying on a table strapped down at the wrists and ankles. Someone was leaning over him, face hidden by a surgical mask, speaking in a voice he almost recognized. The words were muffled, distorted like listening underwater. Subject is stable, proceeding with implant. A pressure on his skull. Not pain exactly, but awareness of something foreign pushing into places it didn't belong. And then darkness, absolute and total, like someone had flipped a switch. Eli stumbled, caught himself against a tree. His hands were shaking. Ranger circled back, pressing against his leg, a low whine vibrating through the dog's chest. Eli looked down, saw the concern in those amber eyes, and forced himself to breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way they'd taught him in BUD/S when panic tried to drown you. "Are you okay?" Claire's voice somewhere to his left. "Fine," he said. The lie tasted like metal. They kept moving. The sun climbed higher, burning through the cloud cover just enough to turn the forest into a cathedral of gray light and shadow. The temperature dropped as they gained elevation, the air thinning each breath, feeling like it carried less oxygen than the one before. Emma stirred once, mumbling something in her sleep that might have been a name or just the fever talking. Eli adjusted his grip, kept her close to his body heat. Another memory surfaced, sharper this time. He was sitting in a chair, electrodes attached to his head, wires snaking away to machines he couldn't see. A man stood in front of him, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing fatigues without insignia. The man's face was clear now, familiar, impossible. Colonel Wade Garrison, Eli's commanding officer, his mentor, the man who'd pulled him out of the fire in Mosul, who'd stood beside him at Sarah's funeral, who'd supposedly died 2 years ago in a roadside bombing outside Damascus. But here he was in this memory that couldn't be real, speaking in that calm, authoritative voice that expected obedience. "This is for your own good, Eli. You're broken right now. Sarah's death broke something in you that won't heal on its own. We're going to fix that, make you whole again, make you useful." Eli had tried to respond, tried to argue, but his mouth wouldn't work. His body wouldn't move. He was a passenger in his own skin, watching helplessly as Garrison nodded to someone off-screen and the machines began to hum. "Stop," Eli said out loud, his voice cracking. Claire and Ranger both turned. Eli realized he'd stopped walking, was standing in the middle of a clearing with his eyes closed, sweat pouring down his face despite the cold. "What's wrong?" Claire asked. "Nothing. Memory, it's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. The memories were coming faster now, flashes of white rooms and surgical lights and voices he recognized but shouldn't. And underneath it all, a growing certainty that the past 4 years of his life had been built on a foundation of lies. That the grief and isolation and silence hadn't been his choice at all, but something programmed into him. A way to keep him contained, controlled, out of sight until they needed him again. Ranger moved closer, his nose pushing against Eli's hand. The dog's presence was an anchor, something real and solid in a world that suddenly felt like it was coming apart. Eli scratched behind Ranger's ears, felt the familiar shape of scar tissue, the warmth of living flesh. This was real. The dog was real. Whatever they'd done to him, they hadn't taken this. "We need to keep moving," Claire said gently. "They're still looking." Eli opened his eyes, nodded, shifted Emma's weight, and started walking again. One foot in front of the other. The only way through was forward. By midday, they'd covered maybe 15 miles. The terrain had shifted from dense forest to alpine meadows, dotted with patches of late-season snow. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of weather moving in. Eli scanned the sky, saw dark clouds massing to the west. Snow coming maybe by nightfall. That was both good and bad. Good because it would cover their tracks, make thermal imaging useless. Bad because Emma's fever and Claire's injury, and the simple mathematics of exposure, meant they needed shelter before the storm hit. They stopped to rest beside a stream, the water running clear and cold over smooth stones. Eli set Emma down on a bed of pine needles, checked her temperature. Still elevated, but not critical. He crushed another ibuprofen tablet, mixed it with stream water, spooned it carefully into her mouth. She swallowed without waking. Claire collapsed against a tree, her face gray with exhaustion. Eli knelt beside her, unwrapped the field dressing on her side. The wound had stopped bleeding, but the edges were inflamed red, creeping outward. Infection starting. He cleaned it with antiseptic from his med kit, rewrapped it with fresh gauze. She flinched but didn't cry out. "How much farther?" she asked. 40 miles, maybe more. "We're not going to make it, are we?" Eli didn't answer right away. He finished securing the dressing, sat back on his heels. Ranger was drinking from the stream, lapping water with long, steady strokes. The forest around them was quiet, just wind in the trees and the murmur of water. For a moment, it almost felt peaceful. "Your father," Eli said finally. "Marcus. When I pulled him out of that building in Ramadi, half his chest was gone. Shrapnel had torn through his lungs, shattered 3 ribs, nicked his heart. He should have been dead before we even got him to the evac point. But he held on for 40 minutes, conscious the whole time, talking to me about his daughter, about you." Claire looked at him, waiting. "He told me you were studying to be a doctor, that you were brilliant, stubborn, too brave for your own good, that you'd inherited his sense of justice and it was going to get you in trouble someday. And then he made me promise that if something happened to him, I'd look out for you, not protect you exactly. He knew you wouldn't need that. Just be there if you ever needed someone who understood what it meant to keep fighting when everything says you should quit." He paused, looking at the water. "That's what we're doing now. We're holding on. 40 more miles, one step at a time, until we can't take another step. And then we'll take one more, because quitting isn't an option." Claire's eyes were wet, but she didn't look away. "He talked about you sometimes. After Ramadi, said you were the kind of soldier who made everyone around you better. The kind who'd run toward the fire when everyone else was running away. He gave me too much credit." "Did he?" Eli stood, shouldered his pack. "We move in 5 minutes. Drink water, eat something if you can. Next stop is the ridge line, another 8 miles up." The afternoon turned colder. They climbed through switchbacks that got steeper and narrower, the trail, sometimes nothing more than a suggestion carved into the mountainside centuries ago by animals that knew these paths better than any map. Eli's knees screamed with every upward step, the old injuries making themselves known. Behind him, Claire's breathing grew more labored, her pace slowing, but she didn't ask to stop, didn't complain, just kept putting one foot in front of the other, the way her father must have taught her. Ranger ranged ahead, always in sight, but far enough out to catch any threat before it reached them. The dog moved with purpose, nose to the ground, ears swiveling to track sounds Eli couldn't hear. Every so often, Ranger would stop and look back, making sure they were still following. 7 years together, and they developed a language that didn't need words. Another memory hit, this one brief but vivid. Eli on a treadmill, hooked up to monitors, running at a pace that should have destroyed him, but his heart rate was steady, his breathing controlled, his body moving like a machine. Garrison standing beside the treadmill, watching the readouts, nodding in approval. "Remarkable. The implant is integrating perfectly. Physical performance is up 23% from baseline. Stress response is almost flatlined. We've created something extraordinary here." Eli's legs had kept pumping, mechanical and precise, while somewhere deep inside his actual self screamed to stop, to break free, to reclaim control. But the implant wouldn't let him. It had its hooks in his nervous system, his motor cortex, the parts of his brain that translated thought into action. He was a prisoner watching his own body betray him. The memory faded, leaving Eli standing on the trail with his heart pounding and sweat soaking through his shirt. He checked his watch. 4:17 p.m. They'd been moving for almost 12 hours and the sun was already starting to sink toward the horizon. They needed to find shelter before dark, before the temperature dropped below freezing and exposure became the bigger threat than the men hunting them. "There," Claire said, pointing. Eli followed her gaze and saw it. A ranger station maybe half a mile ahead, nestled at the base of a cliff, abandoned by the look of it. The windows were dark, the door hanging crooked on its hinges, but it had walls and a roof, which was more than they had now. They approached carefully, Ranger checking the perimeter, while Eli swept the interior with his rifle. The station was empty, gutted by time and weather. The floor was littered with broken furniture and animal droppings, the walls water-stained and peeling. But it was defensible with only one entrance and good sight lines in all directions. Eli set Emma down on the least damaged section of floor, covering her with his jacket. Claire collapsed beside her, trembling with exhaustion. Eli found a relatively clean corner, pulled out his med kit, and started an IV line in Claire's arm. Saline and antibiotics, the basic life-saving cocktail. She was dehydrated, running a fever of her own now. The infection in her side was spreading faster than he'd hoped. Ranger took up position by the door, lying down, but not relaxing, every sense still alert. Eli joined him there, looking out at the forest as darkness gathered. The wind had picked up, and he could smell snow on the air. The storm would hit by midnight, maybe sooner. He pulled out the satellite phone, powered it up, watched the display search for a signal. 3 bars, good enough. He dialed a number he hadn't used in 2 years, a contact from his SEAL days who'd gone private sector. The kind of person who asked the right questions and didn't ask the wrong ones. The phone rang 4 times before a voice answered, gruff and suspicious. "Who's this?" "It's Corvin. I need a favor." A pause. "Corvin thought you were dead, or at least pretending to be." "Close enough. Listen, I'm in trouble. Need to get to Ash Hollow, the old facility north of Port Angeles. That place is decommissioned. Locked down tight. I know. I also know you still have access codes. You did work there for 6 months after I left." Another pause, longer this time. "What kind of trouble are we talking about?" "The kind that involves Victor Hale and a program called Vestige." The line went silent for so long that Eli thought he'd lost the connection. Then the voice came back, quieter now, careful. "How do you know about Vestige?" "Because I'm in it, Subject Alpha 7, and I need to know what they did to me." "Jesus, Eli, if what you're saying is true, you need to run. Get as far from Hale as possible and disappear." "Already tried that. 4 years of hiding, and it didn't change anything. They'll keep coming until I'm dead or back under their control. Only way out is through." A long exhale. "Ash Hollow's not safe. Last I heard, it's still operational. Black budget off the books. If you go there, you're walking into the lion's den." "That's the idea. Can you get me the access codes or not?" "I'll send them to this number. But Eli, if you're doing what I think you're doing, you're going to need more than codes. You're going to need an army." "I've got Ranger. That's close enough." The call ended. Eli pocketed the phone and looked at the bug who was watching him with those amber eyes that saw too much. "Yeah," Eli said quietly. "I know, bad idea, but it's the only idea we've got." The satellite phone buzzed 20 minutes later. A text message, a string of alphanumeric codes followed by 3 words. "Good luck, brother." Eli memorized the codes, deleted the message, and shut down the phone. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, fat and lazy, drifting through the darkness like ash. The storm was here. He built a small fire in what remained of the station's fireplace using deadwood and kindling he'd gathered from outside. The flames caught slowly, reluctant, but eventually they took hold and began to push back the cold. Claire and Emma both gravitated toward the warmth, unconscious, but responding to its pull. Eli sat with his back against the wall, rifle across his knees, watching the entrance. Ranger settled beside him, head resting on Eli's thigh. The dog's breathing was steady and deep, but Eli knew he wasn't sleeping. Just resting, conserving energy, waiting for the moment when he'd be needed. "You remember Wade Garrison?" Eli asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Ranger's ear twitched. The dog remembered. They'd both served under Garrison, trusted him, followed his orders into some of the worst places on earth. Garrison had been more than a commanding officer. He'd been a teacher, a mentor, the kind of leader who made you believe you could accomplish the impossible because he'd already done it himself. And if the memories Eli was having were real, if Garrison had survived Syria and taken over Project Vestige, then everything Eli thought he knew about the man was a lie, which meant everything Eli thought he knew about himself might be a lie too. The fire burned down to coals. The snow fell heavier, accumulating on the windowsills and doorframe, muffling the world outside. Eli dozed, not sleeping, but not quite awake, that twilight state where the mind drifts and memories surface like bodies in dark water. He was in the white room again, but this time the memory was clearer. Garrison was speaking, his voice calm and paternal. The implant will help you, Eli. You're suffering from acute grief disorder, PTSD survivor's guilt. The normal treatments aren't working, but this will. It'll regulate your neurochemistry, suppress the trauma response, give you back the ability to function. You'll still be yourself, just a better version. The version Sarah would have wanted you to be. Eli's voice thick and distant. I don't want this. I know, but sometimes what we need and what we want aren't the same thing. Trust me, son, I've never led you wrong before. The memory shifted. Eli strapped to the chair, unable to move, while technicians swarmed around him with instruments he didn't understand. Garrison standing back, arms crossed, watching with satisfaction as they opened a small section of Eli's skull and inserted something that looked like a grain of rice but wasn't. Neural interface online. Subject is responding to preliminary commands. Motor function nominal. Cognitive function within acceptable parameters. Recommendation, proceed to phase 2 conditioning. Garrison nodding. Approved. Begin the process. And then the pain like fire spreading through every nerve in his body, like his brain was being rewritten. One synapse at a time. Eli had screamed or tried to, but his voice wouldn't work. The implant had shut it down along with everything else that made him more than meat and bone. The memory ended with Garrison's face very close, his expression almost gentle. When you wake up, you won't remember any of this. You'll think you spent 3 months recovering from grief, working through your trauma in healthy ways. You'll decide to move somewhere quiet, somewhere remote. You'll tell yourself it's your choice, and in a way it will be. The implant doesn't control you, Eli. It just guides you, helps you make better decisions, keeps you stable until we need you again. A pause, and we will need you again. Eli jerked awake, his heart hammering. The fire had burned down to almost nothing, just a few glowing embers. The room was freezing, his breath misting in the air. Ranger was standing now, staring at the door, his hackles raised. Eli grabbed his rifle, moved to the window. Outside, through the falling snow, he could see lights. Flashlights bobbing through the trees. Multiple sources spread wide. A search line sweeping toward the ranger station. They'd been found. He moved to Claire, shook her shoulder. We have to go. Now. She woke hard, confused and disoriented. What? They're here, 2 minutes out, maybe less. Claire tried to stand, collapsed. The infection had gotten worse, draining her strength. Eli caught her, pulled her upright. Can you carry Emma? I'll try. Don't try, do it. He helped her lift the child, then grabbed his pack and rifle. Ranger was already at the back window, the one that looked out onto the cliff face. There was a ledge there, maybe 18 inches wide, running along the base of the rock. It would be slippery, treacherous, potentially fatal, but it was the only way out that didn't go through the men coming in the front. Follow me, Eli said. Step where I step. Don't look down. He climbed out the window boots, finding purchase on snow-covered stone. The ledge was worse than he'd thought, crumbling in places, slick with ice. The drop was maybe 60 feet onto rocks that would kill you just as dead as a bullet. He moved slowly, testing each foothold before committing his weight. Claire came after him. Emma clutched against her chest. Eli could hear her breathing fast and panicked. I can't do this, she whispered. You can. You are. Keep moving. Behind them, the sound of boots on wood. Voices calling out in clipped, professional tones. The ranger station being cleared room by room. It would take them maybe 30 seconds to realize their quarry had slipped out. The ledge narrowed to nothing. Eli stopped, looked around. Ranger had already jumped down to a lower outcropping landing with cat-like grace. The drop was maybe 8 feet, Doable if you didn't break an ankle. Eli went first, hanging from the ledge by his hands, then dropping. He landed hard, felt something pop in his knee, ignored it. Reached up. Emma first. Lower her down. Claire did, straining with the effort. Eli caught the child, set her gently on solid ground. Then Claire came less gracefully, falling the last few feet. Eli caught her too, steadied her. They were in a narrow ravine now, steep walls on either side, snow accumulating fast. It led downhill away from the ranger station into terrain that got rougher and more broken. They ran. Gunfire erupted behind them, muzzle flashes strobing the darkness. Bullets chewed into rock and ice, sending up sprays of debris. Eli fired back blind just to make them keep their heads down, then kept moving. Ranger led the way, finding paths through the maze of stone and snow, somehow knowing where to go, even though none of them had ever been here before. The shooting stopped. Voices calling out, coordinating. They'd split up, some following on foot, others probably circling around to cut off escape routes. Professional tactics, which meant professional operators, which meant this was going to get worse before it got better, if it got better. The ravine opened into a boulder field, massive stones the size of houses scattered across a steep slope. Eli led them into it, using the boulders for cover, zigzagging to break any line of sight. His lungs burned his knee, screaming with every step. Claire was barely keeping up, stumbling every few yards. Emma had woken up and was crying now, soft broken seams that tore at something in Eli's chest. They couldn't run forever. Eventually the math would catch up to them. Too many hunters, too few places to hide, too much distance still to cover. A boulder ahead, bigger than the rest, with a gap underneath like a shallow cave. Eli made a decision. In there. Now. They crawled into this gap, pressing themselves against cold stone. Eli positioned himself at the opening, rifle ready. Ranger squeezed in beside him, trembling with adrenaline, but silent. Emma had stopped crying, gone quiet in that terrible way children do when they understand that sound means death. Footsteps crunched through snow, moving closer. Eli slowed his breathing, finger on the trigger, waiting. A figure appeared 30 yards out, sweeping a flashlight beam across the boulder field. Then another figure and another. 4 men moving in a diamond formation, professional and careful. One of them stopped, raised a hand. The others halted. The first man pulled out a radio, spoke into it. Eli couldn't hear the words, but he understood the posture. They'd lost the trail, were regrouping, waiting for orders. The radio crackled. A voice came through, clear and authoritative and impossible. All units fall back to extraction point. The asset is headed for Ash Hollow. We'll intercept him there. Eli's blood turned to ice. He knew that voice. Would have known it anywhere, even after 2 years of believing it was silence forever. Colonel Wade Garrison. The 4 men turned and started back toward the ranger station, moving fast, now called off the hunt. Within minutes they were gone, swallowed by darkness and snow. Eli didn't move for a long time, couldn't move his mind, trying to process what he just heard. Garrison was alive. Not just alive, but in command, running the operation, which meant everything Claire had told him was true. The program, the implant, the control, and it meant that Ash Hollow wasn't a refuge. It was a trap. Claire touched his arm. What do we do? Eli looked at her, then at Emma, then at Ranger. The dog was watching him, waiting for the decision that would determine whether they lived or died. We go anyway, Eli said quietly, because the only way to end this is to face him, to face what he did to me, and make him answer for it. That's suicide. Maybe, but it's the only move we have left. They crawled out of the gap and started moving again north toward the mountains, toward the facility buried in stone and snow, toward the man who'd made Eli into something he didn't understand. The storm closed in around them, and the darkness was absolute, and somewhere ahead, Wade Garrison was waiting with answers Eli wasn't sure he wanted to hear. But he'd made a promise to a dying man 6 years ago, and promises, Eli had learned, were the only things that kept you human when everything else tried to strip that away. 1 more mile, then another, the storm howling, Ranger leading, Emma silent against Claire's chest. and Eli walking forward into whatever came next, because forward was the only direction that mattered. They walked through the night, the storm eventually breaking just before dawn. The wind died down the snow, thinning to occasional flurries that caught the first gray light like suspended dust. Ranger led them down the final ridge, one last descent, through old-growth pine into the valley that held all the answers. Eli's legs moved on autopilot muscles, burning each step a negotiation with exhaustion. Behind him, Claire's breathing had gone shallow and quick, but she kept Emma close and kept moving. That was all that mattered. Keep moving. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Olympic Mountains, the storm having passed sometime in the night. Eli stood at the edge of a ridge looking down into a valley that shouldn't exist on any map. Ash Hollow. The facility was there exactly where his memory said it would be, buried into the mountainside like a scar that refused to heal. Concrete blast doors set into living rock. Ventilation shafts camouflaged as natural formations. The whole complex invisible from the air, accessible only by a single access road that wound through terrain designed to shred anyone who didn't know the safe path. They had made it. 48 hours of running, hiding, bleeding. Emma was still breathing, her fever finally broken. Claire was conscious, though the infection had left her weak and shaking. And Ranger stood beside Eli, snow crusted in his fur, watching the facility with the same wary intelligence he'd shown every threat they'd faced. Eli checked his watch. 6:42 a.m. The facility's morning shift change would happen at 700 if they were still running on the old schedule. A narrow window when attention would be divided, when one more person slipping through security might go unnoticed. Assuming the access codes his contact had sent were still valid. Assuming Garrison hadn't changed every protocol the moment he had taken over. Assuming this wasn't exactly what Garrison wanted. Claire moved up beside him. Emma asleep in her arms. The child's face was peaceful now, color returning to her cheeks. She'd make it. Whatever else happened, Emma would survive this. "You're sure about this?" Claire asked quietly. Eli didn't answer right away. Was he sure? No. He wasn't sure about anything anymore. His memories were compromised, his body potentially under someone else's control, his entire sense of self built on foundations that might be lies. But uncertainty wasn't the same as paralysis. You could move forward without knowing the outcome. That's what soldiers did. What humans did when the alternative was giving up. "Garrison's in there," Eli said finally. "The answers are in there. The proof we need to expose Vestige to shut it down to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. So yes, I'm sure." He pulled out the satellite phone, checked the codes one more time, then powered it down for the last time. No more outside contact. From here on, they were alone. They descended into the valley using a deer trail that switched back through dense pine. Ranger scouted ahead, nose to the ground, reading the terrain for tripwires, sensors, anything that might announce their presence. The facility grew larger as they approached, concrete and steel emerging from natural stone like something grown rather than built. 20 yards from the access door, Ranger stopped. His ears flattened, hackles rising along his spine. Not the aggressive stance, but the warning one. Something ahead, something wrong. Eli held up a fist. Claire stopped, lowering Emma to the ground. They waited in silence, barely breathing. And then Eli saw it. A camera disguised as a rock outcropping its lens, aimed directly at the approach path. He tracked the angle, spotted two more. A triangle of overlapping coverage, impossible to avoid. They'd been spotted the moment they entered the valley. The access door cycled open with a hydraulic hiss. A figure stepped out, silhouetted against the fluorescent light from inside. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the easy confidence of someone who owned every space he entered. The figure stepped forward, and the morning light caught his face. Colonel Wade Garrison, alive, unchanged, looking exactly the way Eli remembered from 1,000 briefings, 100 missions, one funeral that had apparently been theater. "Hello, Eli," Garrison said, his voice carrying across the distance with parade ground authority. "Welcome home." Eli's hand moved to his rifle, but Garrison raised a palm. "Don't. You're covered by 4 snipers right now. 2 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and 2 more you haven't spotted. You'd be dead before your finger touched the trigger. Eli didn't doubt it. He lowered his hand, kept it visible. You were dead. Syria. IED on the Damascus Road. I was reborn, Garrison said. Shed the old skin, took on something better. The military wouldn't let me finish what I'd started. Too many politicians, too much oversight, too many people worried about ethics and optics. So I went private. Hale gave me the resources. I gave him results. Results, Eli said. The word tasted like ash. That's what you call turning soldiers into remote-controlled weapons. Garrison smiled thin and cold. I call it evolution. You of all people should understand. You were the proof of concept. Subject Alpha 7. The first one to integrate successfully to live a normal life while carrying the interface completely unaware of its presence. You proved we could do this without breaking the mind. Could create assets that function in civilian society until activation. I'm not an asset, I'm a person. You're both. That's the beauty of it. Garrison took a step closer. Tell me, Eli, the last 4 years, living alone, avoiding people, keeping to yourself. You thought that was your choice, didn't you? Your way of dealing with grief. Eli's jaw tightened. He knew where this was going, could feel the trap closing. It wasn't, Garrison continued. The implant guided you there, kept you isolated, manageable, available. Every decision you thought you were making freely was influenced by programming we installed. Your solitude wasn't healing, Eli. It was storage. We put you on a shelf until we needed you again. Claire's voice cut through sharp with anger. That's not possible. Neural interfaces can't override free will. The technology doesn't exist. Garrison's smile widened. It does now. And you helped us build it, Dr. Harlow. All those research papers your father wrote about neuroplasticity, about reprogramming trauma responses, we used his work. Ironic, isn't it? Claire went pale. My father would never. He didn't know. None of them knew. That's how research works. Everyone contributes their small piece and someone else assembles the weapon. Garrison's eyes shifted to Emma. The child looks better. Fever's broken. Don't, Eli said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. Don't even look at her. Protective instincts. Good. That means the implant hasn't damaged your emotional responses. We were worried about that. Garrison pulled out a small device about the size of a phone. Do you know what this is? Eli didn't answer. It's a remote activation key. One button press, and the interface in your skull receives a command. Could be anything. Drop your weapon, attack the woman, walk into the facility and sit down. Your conscious mind won't have a say. The implant overrides your motor cortex and your body obeys. You're bluffing. Am I? Garrison's thumb hovered over the button. Let's find out. Command string Cobalt Sierra 9, execute. The word hit Eli like an electric shock. His vision tunneled edges going black. His muscles locked, every nerve firing at once. He could feel something moving in his head, a presence that wasn't him reaching into his brainstem, his cerebellum, the ancient parts that controlled movement and breath. His right hand lifted toward his rifle without his consent, fingers curling around the grip, barrel rising. No, Eli screamed it inside his mind, fighting, pushing back against the invasion. His hand trembled, the rifle wavering. Ranger was beside him, pressing against his leg, whining in distress. The dog's warmth, his solid presence, became an anchor, something real to hold on to. Sarah's face flashed through his memory. Not a command, not programming. Just the woman he'd loved, the life they'd planned, the future stolen by black ice and bad timing. She wouldn't want this. Wouldn't want him to become a puppet dancing on someone else's strings. The rifle barrel dropped. Eli's hand opened, letting the weapon fall to the ground. He stood there shaking with the effort of resistance, every muscle screaming, but standing, still himself. Garrison's expression shifted from satisfaction to something like surprise. Impressive. The emotional override. We theorized it was possible, but you're the first to demonstrate it. The implant's control weakens in the presence of strong trauma associations. Your wife's death created a firewall we didn't anticipate. Sarah, Eli said through gritted teeth. Her name was Sarah. I know. I attended her funeral, gave a very moving speech about sacrifice and service. Garrison pocketed the device. The car accident. Black ice, wasn't it? Terrible tragedy. Something in his tone made Eli's blood freeze. What are you saying? I'm saying that sometimes when a subject proves difficult to manage, we need to remove emotional anchors, create isolation, make them more compliant. The truck driver walked away with minor injuries. Very lucky for him, very unlucky for Sarah. The words landed like bullets. Eli felt the world tilt, reality shifting beneath his feet. You killed her. You murdered my wife. I facilitated her removal from your operational environment. Garrison said clinical and calm. Victor Hale authorized it. The driver was one of ours. The accident was choreographed. And 3 months later, when you were drowning in grief, we offered you a solution, a way to stop the pain, the implant. You consented, Eli, signed the paperwork, walked into that surgical suite of your own free will. I don't remember that. Because we erased it. That's what the first 72 hours of conditioning does. Rewrites the memory, creates a false narrative. You think you spent 3 months in a farm working through grief. What you actually did was undergo intensive psychological reconditioning while the implant integrated with your neural tissue. By the time we released you, you believed the isolation was your choice, believed you were healing, but you were just waiting for activation. Eli looked at Claire, saw his own horror reflected in her eyes, looked at Emma sleeping and innocent, looked at Ranger, the only constant in a life built on lies. The dog was watching him, amber eyes full of trust and loyalty that had never wavered. Why, Eli asked, why go through all of this? Why not just kill me if I was a problem? Because you're valuable. The perfect soldier doesn't just follow orders. He survives, adapts, thinks. You have those qualities naturally. The implant just makes them controllable. And when this program goes public, when we start offering it to police departments, private military contractors, anyone willing to pay, you'll be our showpiece. Living proof that enhanced soldiers can integrate into normal society, can have families, jobs, lives, until we need them. I'll never work for you. You don't have a choice, Garrison said. The implant is permanent, can't be removed without killing you. And the programming runs deep. Fight it all you want, but eventually you'll comply. Everyone does. He gestured toward the facility. Come inside. Let's finish this conversation somewhere warm. Bring the woman and child. No one needs to get hurt. Eli didn't move. Beside him, Ranger's growl deepened the sound vibrating through the frozen ground. Or, Garrison continued, we can do this the hard way. I call my teams, they surround you, and we bring you in by force. The woman dies. The child goes to Hale, who is after all her legal grandfather, and you wake up in a cell with your mind completely overwritten. Your choice. The moment stretched, thin and terrible. Eli could feel the weight of every decision that had led here, every choice that hadn't really been his. But this moment right now was real. The gun at his feet, Ranger at his side, Claire and Emma behind him, depending on him to find a way through. He bent slowly, picked up his rifle. Garrison tensed, but Eli didn't raise it, just slung it over his shoulder and started walking toward the facility. Smart, Garrison said. They passed through the blast doors into fluorescent brightness. The corridor beyond was exactly as Eli remembered it, sterile and institutional, smelling of concrete and recycled air. Armed guards flanked them, 4 men in tactical gear, with the dead-eyed professionalism of private contractors. They led the group deeper through security checkpoints and biometric scanners into the heart of the facility. The command center was a circular room dominated by screens and terminals, banks of servers humming along the walls. And standing in front of the central console, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, was Victor Hale. He was smaller than Eli had imagined, compact and refined with silver hair and the kind of face that smiled in boardrooms while signing death warrants. His eyes were intelligent, calculating, completely devoid of warmth. "Mr. Corvin," Halo said, his voice smooth, "I've been wanting to meet you for quite some time. You're something of a legend in our circles. The first successful integration, the prototype. I'm not your property. Legally, you are. You signed the consent forms, agreed to participate in an experimental PTSD treatment program. The implant was disclosed in the paperwork, buried in paragraph 47 of the waiver, but disclosed nonetheless. You just don't remember reading it because you erased my memory. A regrettable necessity, but it doesn't change the legality. You're ours, Mr. Corvin. Mind, body, and the very interesting things we can make you do with both." Claire stepped forward, Emma in her arms. "He's not the only one. There are 892 subjects in your program, and I have proof. Every file, every test result, every death you've tried to hide. The moment this goes public, you're finished." Hale's expression didn't change. "That's why you won't make it public. You'll give me the encryption key, and in exchange, I'll let you walk away. You and the child, simple transaction. No deal. Then the child dies." Hale nodded to one of the guards who stepped forward and grabbed Emma from Claire's arms. The little girl woke, screamed a sound that tore through the sterile air. Claire lunged, but another guard caught her, slammed her against the wall hard enough that Eli heard something crack. Ranger exploded into motion. The dog launched himself at the guard, holding Emma 90 pounds of muscle and fury. His jaws locked onto the man's wrist teeth, sinking deep. The guard screamed, dropping Emma. She hit the floor, scrambled backward toward Claire. Garrison pulled his sidearm, aimed at Ranger. "Down or I shoot the dog." Eli's world narrowed to that moment. The gun, Ranger, the choice that wasn't a choice at all. "Don't. Call him off. Ranger, release." The command came automatically, years of training. Ranger let go, backed away, blood on his muzzle. He positioned himself between Emma and the guards, hackles, raised teeth bared, ready to protecting her. "Good," Garrison said. "Now everyone calm down. We're all professionals here." Hale straightened, his jacket composure returning. "Dr. Harlow, you've made this more difficult than it needed to be. But I'm a reasonable man. Give me the encryption key and I'll let you leave with your sister." "My sister?" Claire's face went white. "You said you had her, that she was alive." "She is, in a manner of speaking." Hale gestured to one of the screens. It flickered to life, showing a woman strapped to a chair in a white room. She looked like Claire, same dark hair, same bone structure. But her eyes were empty, staring at nothing. "Anna underwent the procedure 6 months ago," Hale said. "Full neural reconditioning. She's been very useful in our research. And with the right commands, she can still function. Cook clean, follow simple instructions. A bit like a living doll. You could take her home if you'd like. She won't remember you, but she won't resist either." Claire made a sound like she'd been gutted. Eli felt rage building in his chest, hot and lethal. This was what they did, what they'd been doing to veterans, to civilians, to anyone they could get their hands on, turning people into things. "You're a monster," Claire whispered. "I'm a businessman. There's a demand for compliant personnel. I supply it. The morality is irrelevant." Hale checked his watch. "You have 30 seconds to give me the key, or the child joins your sister in the conditioning suite." Emma was crying, clutching at Claire's leg. Ranger stood between them and the guards, his body coiled. Eli could see the calculations running behind the dog's eyes. How many threats, how much distance, what were the odds of survival? And the conclusion Ranger reached was the same one Eli had. They weren't getting out of this by following rules. "Claire," Eli said quietly, "the key, give it to him." She looked at him, betrayed. "What? We're outgunned, outmaneuvered. We can't win this fight. Give him what he wants." Garrison smiled. Finally, some sense. Claire's hands were shaking as she pulled out a piece of paper, wrote down a string of numbers and letters. handed it to Hale. He took it, plugged it into the terminal. The screen filled with files, thousands of them, evidence spanning years. Hale's smile widened. Excellent. Now we can erase all of this, and no one will ever know. His fingers moved toward the delete key. Eli's hand shot to his jacket pocket, pulled out the satellite phone, and threw it hard at the terminal. The device smashed into the keyboard, and in that same instant, Eli grabbed Garrison's wrist, twisted, sent the gun spinning away. Ranger launched himself at the nearest guard jaw's finding throat. The room erupted into chaos. Claire grabbed Emma and ran for the door. Eli fought Garrison hand-to-hand, brutal and close, every move fueled by years of rage and betrayal. The other guards were shooting but couldn't get a clear line without hitting their own people. Ranger was everywhere at once, a shadow of teeth and fury. Hale dove for the terminal, trying to salvage the deletion. Eli saw it, kicked away from Garrison, and tackled the CEO. They went down hard, Eli's fist connecting with Hale's jaw once, twice. The man went limp. Eli. Claire's scream. He looked up, saw Garrison with a rifle aiming at Claire and Emma as they reached the corridor. Ranger saw it too. The dog didn't hesitate. He sprinted across the room and leaped, putting his body between the rifle and the child. The shot was deafening. Ranger jerked in midair, hit the ground hard. Didn't get up. Time stopped. Eli saw Ranger lying there, blood spreading beneath him. Saw Emma reaching for the dog, crying. Saw Garrison working the bolt, chambering another round. Something broke inside Eli, not the implant. Something deeper. The last restraint that kept him human instead of weapon. He crossed the distance in 3 strides, moving faster than thought. Grabbed Garrison by the throat, lifted him, slammed him against the wall hard enough to crack concrete. You killed my wife, Eli said, his voice empty. You killed my dog. You killed everything I had left. Garrison's hands clawed at Eli's grip, finding no purchase. The implant, he gasped. Cobalt. Sierra. 9. The words should have worked, should have shut Eli down, made him compliant. But the implant was designed to control a soldier. What stood here now, holding a man's life in his hands, wasn't a soldier anymore. It was grief and rage given form, and grief didn't take orders. Eli's grip tightened. Garrison's eyes bulged, and then the resistance stopped. Eli let the body fall, turned toward Ranger. The dog was still breathing shallow and wet. Eli dropped to his knees, gathered Ranger into his arms. Blood soaked through his shirt, warm and awful. Hey, boy, Eli whispered. Hey, stay with me. Ranger's eyes found his amber and dimming. The dog's tail moved once, a final wag. An acknowledgement. A goodbye. You did good, Eli said, his voice breaking. Saved her, saved them. You did so good. Ranger's breathing slowed, stuttered, stopped. The light faded from his eyes, and Eli was holding a body that used to be his best friend, his brother, his reason for staying alive when everything else said to quit. Emma was there, small hands touching Ranger's fur. Mr. Eli, she whispered, her first words since her mother died. Mr. Eli, he's not breathing. Eli couldn't speak, could only hold the doll and feel the weight of 7 years of loyalty and love and sacrifice settling into memory. Claire pulled Emma back, gentle but firm. We have to go. Security will be here any second. Eli stood, leaving Ranger on the floor, walked to the terminal where the files were still open, pulled out a USB drive from his pocket, the backup he'd made before they had even left the ranger station, plugged it in, initiated upload to every major news outlet, every government agency, every watchdog organization he could think of. 892 files, every victim, every crime, everything. Alarms started blaring. The facility lockdown initiated, but too late. The files were already gone, scattered to the wind, impossible to recall. Hale stirred on the floor, groaning. Eli grabbed him, zip-tied his hands, dragged him toward the exit. What are you doing? Claire asked, making sure he faces what he's done. They ran through corridors, filling with guards. Eli fired controlled bursts, not to kill, but to suppress, to buy seconds. They reached the blast doors just as FBI teams were breaching from the outside, drawn by the satellite transmission Eli had triggered. Sienna Vale was with them, the recon specialist, her face grim with satisfaction. "We got your upload," she said. "Every news channel is running it. Hale's finished." Eli shoved the CEO toward the federal agents. "He's yours. Add murder to the list. My wife, Sarah Corvin, February 2021. He ordered it." The agents took Hale away. Eli walked out into morning sunlight, Claire and Emma beside him. The storm had passed. The sky was clear, and Ranger was gone. 4 months later, Eli stood in front of a Senate committee testifying under oath. They'd removed the implant 2 weeks after Ash Hollow, a delicate surgery that left him with a scar and a gap where foreign technology used to live. He felt lighter, more himself, but also emptier, like something essential had been carved away. He told them everything: the program, the deaths, the control. 892 victims, 247 confirmed dead, the rest scattered, broken, trying to rebuild lives from fragments. He gave them names, dates, evidence. And when he was finished, they gave him immunity in a medal he didn't want. Hale got life without parole. Garrison was dead buried without honors. The program was shut down, the facility demolished. It should have felt like victory. It didn't. Eli stood on the Olympic Peninsula cliff, looking out at the ocean. A memorial cairn rose beside him. Stones piled carefully. Ranger's collar draped over the top. Bronze plaque beneath Ranger. Loyalty beyond life. 2018 to 2025. Emma walked up, 7 years old now, speaking again. She placed a carved wooden wolf at the base of the cairn, something she'd made in art class. "For Ranger," she said. "He'd like that," Eli replied. Claire joined them, healthier now, working for a veterans advocacy group. "You ready?" Eli nodded. They walked down to the beach together, the three of them. Emma found shells, collected them in careful piles. Claire talked about a new bill and Congress protections for research subjects. Eli listened, but his mind was elsewhere. He could still feel the weight of Ranger in his arms, could still see those amber eyes dimming. The dog had given everything, asked for nothing, had chosen loyalty over survival, protection over self-preservation. That was what separated them from the men who tried to turn soldiers into machines, the ability to choose sacrifice, to love something more than breathing. Emma brought him a shell, perfect and whole. "This one's the best," she said. Eli took it, held it up to the light. "Yeah, it is." The ocean rolled on, endless and patient. The sun climbed higher. And somewhere in the space between memory and grief, Eli felt something shift. Not healing exactly, but acceptance. The understanding that loss carved you hollow, so love had room to grow. They walked back toward the cabin as evening approached. Emma ran ahead laughing. Claire walked beside Eli, close but not touching. "You could get another dog," she said quietly. "When you were ready." Eli shook his head. "Wouldn't be fair, to me or the dog. Ranger wasn't replaceable." "No one is." "Exactly." They reached the cabin and Eli looked back one more time at the cairn on the cliff. The collar caught the last light gleaming, a marker for something that couldn't be measured or controlled or programmed, something that had been freely given and had cost everything. Inside, Emma was already drawing her crayon, moving across paper with fierce concentration. Eli looked over her shoulder, saw what she was making, a man, a woman, a child, and beside them, rendered in careful detail, a dog with amber eyes. "That's us," Emma said. "The family." Eli felt his throat tighten. "Yeah, that's us." Later, after Emma was asleep and Claire had gone to the guest room, Eli sat alone by the window. The driftwood wolf Emma had carved sat on the sill, watching the darkness. He picked it up, felt the rough texture, the care in each cut. His voice, when he spoke, was barely a whisper. "Wade Garrison taught me to be a weapon. Sarah taught me to be human. You taught me what it means to choose, even when choosing costs everything. Freedom isn't free. Some debts you pay with all you have. And when the ledger balances, you get to decide who you become next." He set the carving down, stood, walked to the door, opened it. The night air was cold and clean, carrying salt and pine. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Not Ranger, just another animal living its life. But for a moment, Eli let himself imagine it was. Let himself believe that loyalty didn't end with breathing, that the best parts of us survived in the people we'd saved, the choices we'd made, the love we'd given without counting the cost. He closed the door, turned out the lights, and lay down in the dark. Tomorrow he'd wake early, make breakfast for Emma, talk strategy with Claire about the next phase of advocacy work. He'd keep moving forward because forward was the only direction that mattered. And he'd carry Ranger with him, not as grief, but as proof. Proof that even in a world that tried to reduce people to code and control something wild and free and utterly human, could still choose to love, to protect, to sacrifice. And that choice, more than any implant or program or technology, was what made them more than the sum of their parts. What made them, against all odds and in defiance of every force that tried to break them, finally and irrevocably free. Outside, the ocean breathed, the night held, and somewhere in the dark, a promise kept echoed into morning.